You asked if a U.S. senator once caned another senator right there on the Senate floor. And it's a good question because it gets at a really wild, ugly moment in American history. The direct answer is not quite, but something very similar, and maybe even worse in its implications, did happen. It wasn't exactly a senator caning another senator, and it wasn't during a formal session on the Senate floor. But a member of Congress did brutally cane a senator, and it happened in the Senate chamber itself. This wasn't some backroom fight, it was a public act of violence that shook the country. It showed just how divided and how angry people had become, especially over the issue of slavery. To really understand what happened, you have to go back to the 1850s. The country was a pressure cooker. For decades, the North and South had been arguing about slavery. It wasn't just about morality, it was about power. Would new states be free or slave? Every time a new territory opened up, this fight got hotter. There had been compromises, like the Missouri Compromise in 1820 and the Compromise of 1850. Those deals tried to keep things balanced, to draw lines in the sand, saying where slavery could or couldn't go. But these were temporary fixes, like patching a leaky dam. The pressure kept building. And then came the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. This law was a big deal, and it really messed things up. It basically said that the people living in new territories, specifically Kansas and Nebraska, could decide for themselves whether they wanted slavery or not. This idea was called popular sovereignty. On the surface, it sounded fair, like letting local people choose. But it totally undid the Missouri Compromise, which had kept slavery out of those areas. For many Northerners, this was a huge betrayal. It meant slavery could expand into places they thought were safe from it. It felt like a deliberate push to spread slavery. So naturally, people rushed into Kansas, both pro-slavery and anti-slavery. They wanted to swing the vote their way. This led to what people called Bleeding Kansas. It wasn't just political debates, it was actual violence. People were killing each other. The towns were burned. Fake elections were held. It was a preview of the Civil War, a small-scale conflict fought over the very issue that divided the nation. This was the backdrop, this intense, violent, no-holds-barred fight over slavery that set the stage for the incident you're asking about. Feelings were raw, politicians weren't just arguing, they were often threatening each other, and sometimes those threats turned into action. The halls of Congress, usually a place for debate, were full of tension, insults, and even physical threats. Everyone knew something big was coming, but no one knew exactly what it would be or how bad it would get. This was a time when words had serious consequences, and sometimes those consequences were very personal and very brutal. The mood in Washington, D.C. was heavy. Congress was meeting, but it felt more like two hostile camps than a single legislative body. The senators and representatives from the North and South barely spoke to each other outside of official business, and when they did, it was often with suspicion. The debates on the floor weren't just about policy, they were about fundamental moral and economic differences, and they often devolved into personal attacks. Northerners saw Southerners as slave drivers, brutal and unfeeling. Southerners saw Northerners as meddling fanatics trying to destroy their way of life and their property. Each side felt righteous, and each side felt deeply threatened by the other. It was an environment ripe for an explosion, and the fuse was getting shorter every day. The Kansas-Nebraska Act, meant to calm things, had instead poured gasoline on the fire. And this fire would soon flare up in a way no one expected, turning the Senate chamber, a place of supposed decorum, into a scene of shocking violence. Into this heated atmosphere stepped Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts. Sumner was a fiercely anti-slavery man, a powerful orator, and someone who didn't mince words. He was an abolitionist through and through. He believed slavery was a moral abomination, a stain on the nation. He wasn't subtle about his views, and he often used his speeches to condemn not just slavery as an institution, but also the individuals and states that supported it. He saw himself as a champion of justice, speaking truth to power, even if that truth was painful for others to hear. He was known for his long, elaborate speeches full of classical allusions and fiery rhetoric. He could be quite self-righteous, and he often made enemies with his sharp tongue and his absolute certainty in his own moral standing. He didn't care much for Southern sensibilities or for the idea of polite compromise when it came to human bondage. To him, slavery was evil, plain and simple, and there was no room for negotiation. This uncompromising stance, while admired by many in the North, made him a particularly hated figure in the South. They saw him as a radical, a hypocrite, and an insult to their honor. And in a society where honor was everything, especially in the South, this was a dangerous game to play. Then came the speech that really set things off. It was May 19th, 1856. Charles Sumner stood up in the Senate chamber and began to deliver what he called the crime against Kansas. It wasn't just a speech, it was a verbal assault. He spoke for 2 days over several hours. He didn't hold back. He laid out in excruciating detail what he saw as the evils of the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the atrocities happening in bleeding Kansas. He described the pro-slavery forces there as barbaric, as criminals. But he didn't stop there. He didn't just attack the policy or the actions, he attacked the men behind them personally. He named names. Sumner called out Senator Andrew Butler of South Carolina directly. Butler was an older man, a respected figure in the Senate, and a strong defender of slavery. He was also a relative of the man who would later attack Sumner. Sumner described Butler as having chosen a mistress, whom he called the harlot slavery. He then went on, in a truly vicious attack, to mock Butler's speaking style and his physical appearance. He said Butler tuches with a rhetorical flourish the false code of chivalry of the South, and that he discharged himself in a flood of undigested crudities. It was deeply personal, insulting, and frankly designed to provoke. He also attacked Senator Stephen Douglas of Illinois, who was the architect of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Sumner called him a noisome, squat, and nameless animal that penetrated the Senate chamber in order to seize the Kansas territory. Again, these weren't just policy disagreements, these were direct personal insults delivered in a public forum, recorded for history. Sumner's speech was more than just a political argument. It was an act of rhetorical warfare. He aimed to humiliate his opponents, to strip them of their dignity, and to expose what he saw as their moral bankruptcy. He knew exactly what he was doing. He knew the kind of reaction this speech would get, especially from Southerners who held their personal honor so dearly. The reaction to the speech was immediate and fierce. Many Northerners applauded Sumner's courage and his strong stand against slavery. They saw him as a hero speaking truth to power. But in the South, and among Southern sympathizers in Congress, the speech was seen as an unforgivable insult. It wasn't just an attack on their policies, it was an attack on their character, their states, and their families. To call a respected senator state an adulterous mistress, to mock his appearance and his speech, these were not just political barbs. These were fighting words, especially in the context of the Southern Code of Honor, where a gentleman was expected to defend his reputation and his family's honor, often with violence if necessary. And Senator Butler himself was not present in the Senate chamber for all of Sumner's speech. He was unwell, but he quickly learned about the insults. His relatives, his friends, his colleagues, they all heard the speech, or heard about it. And they were enraged. They felt that Sumner had gone too far, that he had crossed a line that should never be crossed in civilized debate. This was not just a disagreement, it was a personal affront, a challenge to their very being. The calls for retribution were loud and clear. Something had to be done. Honor demanded it. And that's where Preston Brooks comes in. Preston Brooks was a representative from South Carolina. He was a relative of Senator Andrew Butler. He was a hot-headed young man, deeply devoted to his state and his family's honor. He was a strong believer in the Southern way of life, including slavery. When he heard about Sumner's speech, and especially the insults directed at his kinsman, Senator Butler, he felt a deep sense of outrage. He saw it as a direct attack on his family and on the South itself. In his mind, Sumner had committed an unpardonable offense. He couldn't let it stand. He had to defend Butler's honor, and by extension, the honor of South Carolina and the entire South. Brooks considered several options. He thought about challenging Sumner to a duel. That was a common way for gentlemen to settle disputes of honor in that era, but he decided against it. He felt that Sumner, as someone who believed slavery was wrong, was not a gentleman, and therefore not worthy of a duel. In Brooks's view, dueling was for equals, and Sumner was beneath him. Plus, duels required courage, and Brooks didn't want to give Sumner the chance to show courage. He wanted to administer a public, humiliating punishment, a physical chastisement. He wanted to beat Sumner like a dog. So, on May 22nd, 1856, 2 days after Sumner finished his incendiary speech, Brooks put his plan into action. He walked into the Senate chamber. The Senate had just adjourned for the day. This is an important detail. It was not during a formal session. The Senate floor was mostly empty. Many senators had already left. And Charles Sumner was sitting at his desk working, writing letters. He was engrossed in his work. He was largely alone in the chamber except for a few other people. Brooks approached Sumner's desk. He had a heavy, gold-headed cane in his hand. He stood over Sumner. "Mr. Sumner," he said, "I have read your speech twice over carefully. It is a libel on South Carolina and Mr. Butler, who is a kinsman of mine." Then, without giving Sumner a chance to respond, Brooks brought the cane down on Sumner's head with full force. He struck him again and again. Sumner, still seated at his desk, was trapped. The desk was bolted to the floor, making it impossible for him to stand up quickly or defend himself. He tried to get up, but the desk pinned him. The blows continued. Brooks was hitting him with incredible violence. The cane was made of thick gutta percha, a hard rubber-like material, and it shattered during the attack. Sumner was stunned, disoriented, and bleeding. He finally managed to wrench himself free from the desk, tearing it from its moorings in the process. He staggered to his feet, but he was badly injured. Brooks continued to beat him, even as Sumner tried to stumble away. Other people in the chamber were slow to react. Some were frozen in shock. Some even tried to intervene, but Brooks was in a rage. Eventually, some men, including a sergeant-at-arms, managed to pull Brooks away from Sumner. By then, Sumner was covered in blood, barely conscious. He collapsed. He had been brutally beaten in the very place where senators were supposed to engage in civil debate. It was an act of extreme violence, carried out in plain sight, and it sent shockwaves across the nation. This was not just a personal fight, it was a political statement, a horrifying example of how far the sectional tensions had escalated. The Senate chamber, a symbol of American democracy and reasoned discourse, had been defiled by a vicious assault. The immediate aftermath of the caning was intense and deeply polarizing. Charles Sumner was seriously injured. He suffered severe head trauma, brain damage, and psychological trauma. He couldn't return to the Senate for over 3 years. He spent that time seeking medical treatment, both in the U.S. and in Europe, trying to recover. His seat in the Senate remained empty, a silent testament to the violence he had endured. In the North, Sumner was seen as a martyr for the anti-slavery cause. His empty chair became a powerful symbol. People saw him as a victim of Southern barbarism, a man who had bravely spoken out against slavery and was brutally silenced for it. And Northerners were outraged by the attack. They held rallies, passed resolutions, and condemned Brooks's actions as an assault on free speech and on the very principles of democracy. The incident further solidified anti-slavery sentiment in the North and fueled the growing animosity towards the South. Preston Brooks, on the other hand, was largely hailed as a hero in the South. He was praised for defending the honor of his kinsmen and his state. Southerners saw Sumner's speech as an intolerable insult, and Brooks's caning as a justified response, a necessary act to uphold Southern honor. They sent him new canes inscribed with messages of support. One was even engraved with the words, "Hit him again." They saw him as a champion who stood up to Northern aggression and insult. He was seen as a brave man who would not let the South be slandered without consequence. Brooks was censured by the House of Representatives for his actions, but that wasn't enough for him. He believed he had acted honorably and he didn't want the censure to stand, so he resigned from his seat in Congress. This might sound like a penalty, but it really wasn't, because almost immediately after he resigned, the people of his district in South Carolina re-elected him. He was sent right back to Washington, D.C., with an even stronger mandate. This re-election sent a clear message from the South they approved of what he did. They supported his violence against Sumner. This act, more than almost anything else, showed how deeply divided the country had become. What was an outrage and a barbaric act to one half of the country was a heroic and necessary act to the other half. There was no common ground, no shared understanding of right or wrong. The political fallout was enormous. The caning of Sumner was not just a personal attack, it was seen by many as a symbol of the breakdown of civility and the increasing willingness to resort to violence in the political arena. It escalated the rhetoric on both sides. Northerners became more convinced that Southerners were aggressive, unhinged, and intent on spreading slavery by any means necessary, even violence. Southerners became more convinced that Northerners were arrogant, insulting, and determined to destroy their society. The incident poured more fuel on the fire of sectionalism. It made compromise seem even more impossible. How could you negotiate with people who beat you unconscious for speaking your mind? How could you respect people who openly celebrated such a brutal attack? The caning of Sumner became another significant event in the chain of escalating tensions, right alongside Bleeding Kansas, that pushed the country closer and closer to civil war. It showed that the verbal battles in Congress were now spilling over into physical violence, indicating a dangerous new phase in the national conflict. The caning of Charles Sumner by Preston Brooks wasn't just a shocking event, it had deep and lasting consequences that echoed for years and helped shape the path toward the Civil War. It became a powerful symbol, a stark image of the violent divisions tearing the country apart. The incident itself, while terrible, was just one piece of a much larger, darker puzzle, but it was a piece that made the whole picture much clearer and much uglier. For many Northerners, the caning of Sumner confirmed their worst fears about the South. It painted an image of a society that was barbaric, uncivilized, and willing to use brute force to silence dissent and uphold slavery. They saw it as an attack on free speech, on the very idea of open debate in a democracy. Sumner, with his severe injuries and his long, painful recovery, became a martyr for the anti-slavery cause. His empty Senate seat, left vacant for years as he recovered, was a constant, visible reminder of Southern aggression and the moral depravity they associated with slavery. The incident galvanized public opinion in the North, strengthening the abolitionist movement and increasing anti-Southern sentiment among people who might not have been staunch abolitionists before. It made the conflict feel more real, more personal. It fueled the growth of the Republican Party, which was founded on an anti-slavery platform, giving them a powerful narrative to rally around. In the South, the incident was interpreted completely differently. Brooks was hailed as a hero, a champion of Southern honor who bravely defended his family and his state against what they saw as intolerable insults. The widespread support for Brooks, the sending of new canes, his quick re-election after resigning, all these things sent a clear message the South approved of his actions. They saw it as a legitimate response to an illegitimate attack. This demonstrated how profoundly different the cultural values and codes of conduct were between the North and the South, especially when it came to honor and reputation. For Southerners, Sumner's words were a direct challenge to their entire way of life, and Brooks's response was a necessary defense. This divergence in interpretation made any further compromise or reconciliation seem almost impossible. If one side saw a hero where the other saw a brutal assailant, how could they ever agree on anything? The caning also highlighted the breakdown of political discourse. The halls of Congress were supposed to be a place for reasoned debate, for lawmaking through discussion and compromise. But the caning showed that those norms had shattered. When physical violence became a substitute for verbal argument, it signaled a dangerous escalation. It meant that the political system itself was failing to contain the sectional conflict. If representatives couldn't even speak freely without fear of physical assault, then the democratic process was fundamentally broken. This added to the sense of crisis and instability that gripped the nation in the years leading up to the Civil War. It made people wonder if the Union could actually hold together. Ultimately, the caning of Charles Sumner was one of those pivotal moments, like Bleeding Kansas or the Dred Scott decision, that moved the country inexorably closer to war. It wasn't the sole cause, but it was a powerful catalyst. It deepened the emotional chasm between North and South. It stripped away any lingering illusions of civility or the possibility of a peaceful resolution to the slavery question. It showed that passions were so inflamed and positions so entrenched that violence was becoming an accepted, even celebrated, part of the political landscape. The incident served as a chilling preview of the brutal conflict that would engulf the nation just a few years later. It underscored the truth that the divisions over slavery were not just political or economic, they were deeply personal, moral, and cultural, and they were tearing the United States apart, one violent act at a time. The legacy of the caning is a stark reminder of how political polarization, when left unchecked and fueled by deep moral disagreements, can lead to the very worst outcomes, even tearing apart a nation. It's a story that still resonates, reminding us of the fragility of civility and the high cost of unchecked division.